stress in the modern world is chronic and not in the right dosage. And so when you have chronic stress, what you'll get is imbalances in your physiology. And imbalances are basically the signature of disease. Along that march of human history, we developed all of these adaptive mechanisms, and that is muscle hypertrophy, and that is probably the most obvious example of good stress.
You talk about also eating stressed plants in your book. Define what that is for us, and what does the science say about that?
Jeff Krasno
is the co-founder and CEO of Commune, a platform focused on personal and societal well-being.
As the host of the Commune podcast, he's interviewed icons like Andrew Huberman, Marianne Williamson, Gabor Mate, and even Matthew McConaughey,
sparking meaningful conversations on wellness, spirituality, and culture.
His popular weekly essay, Commusings, reaches over 1 million subscribers.
And his latest book, Good Stress, shares the protocols that helped him reverse diabetes, lose 60 pounds, and reclaim his health at age 50.
A true pioneer in the wellness space, Jeff also co-created Wanderlust,
the world's largest yoga and wellness festival, and was handpicked by Oprah Winfrey for the Super Soul 100.
Stress at its core actually confers a benefit to the body when it is.
In your book, you have 10 science-backed protocols. So Good Stress lists out these 10 protocols. Which one were you most surprised had the biggest impact on your life?
I will say that the most actual surprising protocol was...
Welcome back to the Dr. Brighten Show. I'm your host, Dr. Jolene Brighten. I'm board certified in naturopathic endocrinology, a nutrition scientist, a certified sex counselor, and a certified menopause specialist. As always, I'm bringing you the latest, most up-to-date information to help you take charge of your health and take back your hormones. If you enjoy this kind of information, I invite you to visit my website, drbrighten.com, where I have a ton of free resources for you, including a newsletter that brings you some of the best information, including updates on this podcast. Now, as always, this information is brought to you cost-free, and because of that, I have to say thank you to my sponsors for making this possible. It's my aim to make sure that you can have all the tools and resources in your hands and that we end the gatekeeping. And in order to do that, I do have to get support for this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I know your time is so valuable and so important, and it's not lost on me that you're sharing it with me right now. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, or share this with a friend because it helps this podcast get out to everyone who needs it. All right, let's dive in. Stress is aging our skin faster, aging our cardiovascular system faster. It is killing our brain cells and the thing leading to chronic disease. But you are saying good stress exists. So tell us about it.
I feel like I'm the PR agent for stress, right?
Getting a rebrand.
Yeah, because we have a justifiably negative association with stress, because stress in the modern world is chronic and not in the right dosage, okay? And so when you have chronic stress in the wrong dosage, what you'll get is imbalances in your physiology. And imbalances are basically the signature of disease. Pick your disease: cardiovascular disease, like lipid imbalances, blood sugar imbalances, hormonal imbalances, neurotransmitter imbalances. Chronic stress will lead to all of those in some ways, and we can break down those mechanisms if you'd like. But what I discovered through studying my own physiology and interviewing about 400 doctors is that stress at its core actually confers a benefit to the body when it is short-term and when it is now deliberate and also in the right dosage. So we evolved over hundreds of thousands of years as Homo sapiens and millions of years as hominids before that in relationship to our environment. You can't really separate the behavior and function of the human organism from the behavior and function of the environment. This is what evolution is. Over time, there are mutations and we adapt. Nature selects for the best of these mutations and we become iterative humans and push ourselves forward. And along that march of human history, we developed all of these adaptive mechanisms in response to stress. So this is sometimes known under the great Nietzsche adage, or if you're cultural anchoring as Kelly Clarkson, which is, for some of your listeners probably, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, right? We might remember that song. And we know this in its simplest form through muscle hypertrophy, right? So we stress a biceps, right, through overloading it in the gym, through either heavy weight or repetition. And what happens? So we micro tear those fibers in that bicep, and there is an immune response. There's like an inflammatory response to that. So there's an injury, right? There's an insult, if you will. And then the body summons these structural proteins, myosin and actin, right? And you give that biceps enough rest, and you have enough protein in your diet, particularly leucine. You're eating your non-fat Greek yogurt, or however you want to get it, your lean chicken. And what happens? That muscle grows back bigger and stronger. That is muscle hypertrophy, and that is probably the most obvious example of good stress, sometimes called eustress. But once you kind of start to unpack the body, you realize we are riddled with those mechanisms, and we can actually leverage stress for our benefit. And that is really the thesis of the book that I wrote called Good Stress.
You had some of your own health issues come up. What was the moment you realized, I can actually leverage stress in a positive way rather than always being at odds with it?
Yeah. Well, in this sense, I will be not your most extraordinary guest. I will be your most ordinary guest you've ever had, because I was suffering from the most ordinary symptoms. And your listeners may be able to, relate to some of these. So, brain fog, check, right? Chronic fatigue, insomnia, irritability, inability to concentrate, the needless need to check my phone every 2 seconds, right?
That's one that a lot of people get conditioned. It's so insidious, and they're conditioned to do it, and then they realize, my life is being spent on social and not actually being social.
That's right. Yeah, I think on average we're checking our phone, somewhere between 350 to 400 times per day.
Ooh, is there an app that counts that?
I don't know. I just read a study, but
yeah. You should make that app, because I'm someone needs to put me in check if I'm doing that.
I know. So those were some of the kind of psychological presentations, and then there were, a lot of insults to my personal vanity, let's say. I had dad bod, so I had that extra kind of layer of inner tube adiposity around the middle, right? Yeah. I had what my 3 daughters love to call the boobs of man.
Teenage girls are so ruthless.
So cruel, right? I was like, that's gynecomastia, kids. They're like, shut up, Dad. Those are man boobs. And then I started, Bryce might have noticed this, your husband, as I was getting into the cold plunge today. He might have noticed that I started growing these strange little ghastly brown protuberances in my armpits and on the back of my neck. I didn't know what those were.
He's not that observant, so I think you're safe.
Good, because they're not particularly attractive. But I later learned that those were presentations of insulin resistance. I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my psychology was compromised, my physiology was compromised, but in ways that are so normalized. But everything I just described is totally abnormal. On the Serengeti, nobody had brain fog, right?
Or skin tags.
And certainly heart disease was basically non-existent, diabetes and obesity basically non-existent, a little bit of cancer, but all, these chronic diseases were just not, on display for most of human history. So, but society has essentially normalized the abnormal. So obviously now we know we have statistics that show us that 60% of Americans have a chronic disease. 40% have 2 chronic diseases. I mean, God bless if you make it to 70 or 80, you generally have 5, and you're treating the symptoms of those diseases, generally with a cocktail of pharmaceutical drugs, never the root cause, et cetera. And we're limping through the last 20 to 30 years of our life with this distension of morbidity.
Yeah.
And I found out, much to my great surprise, that I was well inside of that American nightmare because I got a diabetes diagnosis. So to be clear, a type 2 adult onset diabetes diagnosis. And that started kind of right in the alpenglow of COVID. So I know you got sick during COVID. I also got very sick during COVID. And, I started to look at the data also around people that were getting the most sick, like me, and there tended to be, a disproportionate amount of people with comorbidities, with diabetes and obesity, et cetera. I just described my conditions, and lo and behold, I put a continuous glucose monitor, this little disc that I wear on my triceps, that is a proxy for your metabolic health through sharing on an app your glucose levels moment to moment. And I peered into that app, and lo and behold, my fasting blood glucose was around 125 to 130 milligrams per deciliter.
Yeah.
So the very, very highest end of prediabetes, kind of lowest end of diabetes. And then I went to my primary care physician. Of course, I had probably canceled, like a typical man, like the last 3 appointments.
Was this Skylar who was like, you got to get in there?
Yeah, he was like, go in. And then they did a real blood panel and hemoglobin A1C and all the other, markers. And they're like, yeah, okay. And that was a bucket of ice water over my head before that was a protocol. That was like a wake-up call. You have got to you've got to make some changes in your life. And that really propelled me on this quest to understand why I was so sick, but by extension, why, as Americans and as Westerners, why we are so sick in general. And, that inquest was part intellectual curiosity, but then became very much physical necessity for me to figure that out.
In your book, you have 10 science-backed protocols. So Good Stress lists out these 10 protocols. Which one were you most surprised had the biggest impact on your life?
Yeah, it's really interesting. They all had a lot of impact in different ways, both psychologically and physically, and even socially. I will say, because my main issue initially was metabolic, I would have to categorize the fasting and cold water therapy and kind of some resistance training and the stacking of those were really, really key to essentially a lot of positive weight management, a lot of positive muscle management, but also by extension, I basically tamed the wild tiger of my blood glucose through a kind of intelligent stacking of those protocols and a lot of research and of one experimentation, and a lot of interviewing smart people like yourself. I will say that the most actual surprising protocol was applying these physiological adversity mimetics to my psychological and social life. So we tend to think about good stress protocols like fasting and cold water therapy and sauna, et cetera, within the parentheses of what they can do to your physiology. But actually the most potent impacts of many of those are actually psychological. And as I began to, for example, develop a cold water therapy protocol, when I would get into the cold water, I would have a normal, bottom-up involuntary response, fuck, get me out of here, right? That
Very normal response.
More clinically understood through sort of an increase in respiratory and heart rate, the kind of release of, epinephrine that would course through my veins that would come up into my carotid arteries and feel like I was going to have like a panic attack. And then right there, I had a brief moment available to me to apply top-down conscious pressure on top of involuntary bottom-up response. So how did I do that? Often it was through the leveraging of conscious breath. So some kind of parasympathetic breath work that would essentially allow me to overlay conscious pressure on this involuntary stress response in order to essentially emotionally regulate, to bring myself back to center.
Yeah.
And, I also, you can also use your prefrontal cortex and your neomammalian brain to tell yourself like, oh, it's 58 degrees in here. I'm going to be fine. And yes, cold therapy, when done intelligently, and I'll asterisk that, is that everyone's a bio-individual. Women have a different response to cold therapy, particularly in different cycles of their life than men do. But just more broadly, I would say that getting in the cold for me, it was helpful for my metabolic function. My brown fat would jump into action and thermogenesis and, to upregulate my body temperature into that little warm porridge around 98.6. It would release dopamine over a protracted period of time, all these things that we know about cold therapy. But the biggest thing was like the emotional resilience that it brought me. And what I began to find was the emotional resilience that came out of protocols like cold therapy or fasting began to then punctuate other aspects of my life, kind of spill into them, where I became, honestly, a better parent and a better partner and a better business leader and a better friend, because I had enhanced my ability to emotionally regulate and bring myself back to center and enter into situations with an arrow in my quiver. And that arrow was space, that I enhanced this ability to find, and this is the great Viktor Frankl concept, to find space between stimulus and response. And in that space, there's a choice, and in that choice is your freedom. That's the Frankl idea. But life will inevitably throw you stress balls, in work, in traffic, financial hardship, racism, neglect, abuse. I mean, we live in a world that is essentially designed to trigger us at this point. And so one of the most important things we can do is to be able to enhance those tools and find the modalities that essentially allow us to come back to center, to emotionally regulate. And so finding those first within these physiological practices, I began to really become very, very interested in how I could apply that same concept of chosen deliberate adversity to my social life. And that really manifested in the form of stressful conversations and how to have them. And I began to build a protocol around really stressful, thorny, hard conversations. And I ended up doing 26 hour-long Zoom calls in August and September of 2020 with people that didn't like me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How'd you find them?
Oh, there's a very large repository of them.
Were you like, I suspect they don't like me, or they actually told you I don't like you?
Yeah. Well, I'm exaggerating a tiny bit. They disagreed with me about something.
Okay.
So when COVID lockdown, when we kind of anchored into that port lockdown in March of 2020, my wonderful supportive partner, Jake, who I'll never forgive now, urged me to start to write this weekly missive to our burgeoning commune audience. So this was a pretty significant list. It was about 1.2 million people at that juncture. And so I started to write 1,500 to 2,000 words of like quasi-sense making every Sunday and deploy that out and connect my personal email to it. And of course, 2020 provided plenty of incendiary fodder to write about, right?
Yeah.
So what did we have? We had COVID and a lot of the fear and uncertainty around COVID. We had the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent reckoning around social justice around that. We had an election. We had the rise of QAnon. I mean, fill in the blank. There was so much to write about.
Yeah.
And so I was writing articles that I was trying to essentially take a rigorous approach, sort of a Buddhist Madhyamaka middle path approach to these big social issues, and deploy them in with the hopes of, providing a little, like these little buoys that people could attach to kind of to navigate the rough, crazy seas of that time. But over 2,000 words, and you know this, right? You're bound to piss somebody off with one turn of phrase. And I'll give you an example. Like in August of 2020, there was enough data coming out to suggest that the people that got COVID the most severely had multiple comorbidities, obesity, diabetes, et cetera. So I wrote the most rigorously researched article that I possibly could about that. But of course, there was also a contemporaneous body positivity movement happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And I remember that Monday morning waking up and there was a deluge of opprobrium in the form of emails, like cresting the bow of my inbox. And like hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of mostly women that had taken offense that I was connecting severe COVID outcomes with obesity and metabolic dysfunction. And, there were as many of these emails like I didn't really know what to do with because they were just full of ad hominem and recrimination. But then there was like really dozens of very thoughtful ones.
Yeah.
And so I just vowed that I was going to reply to them. And then after like 2 or 3, email volleys, I was like, hey, let's just jump on a Zoom and talk about it. And I ended up doing that 26 times, not with just that topic, with a whole variety of different topics. But I started to build this regimen, if you will, or practice around how to have profitable, stressful conversations. And they required actually a bunch of very, very clear kind of adversity steps.
The other thing about having those kinds of conversations is that it really demonstrates your faith in the other individual to be able to meet you in that place. And I think sometimes people think like, oh, we just avoid hard conversations all the time because we don't want to feel a certain way. And I think there's also am I going to be in a safe space? And it gives a lot of credit to the other individual that you're like, I believe we can sit down and we can wade through all of this. I want to go back to the stack piece that you said, because I think that's really interesting, because I think often when people think about wellness routines, they think like, you have to do, here's your meditation that you do and your exercise that you do, and everything is very separate and time consuming. We certainly know individuals who like spend 4 hours every morning just to their health. And I'm like, I have kids. I don't have time for that. So I think sometimes it feels like there's this really big barrier. And I think for women listening, it would be helpful to hear like, what happens? So we got to define stack for people. What does that mean? And what happens when you actually integrate these things, doing more than one thing at a time?
Yeah. So stack for me means essentially layering or cadencing intelligently a variety of different protocols together for maximum output or maximum impact, I would say.
Yeah.
And for me, and again, I want to asterisk this because, fasting protocols and cold water therapy protocols really vary for individuals and very much for women. But because my issues were largely metabolic and weight oriented, I found that this stack of essentially intermittent fasting, a ketotarian approach to diet, because previously I had been like committing carbicide, So a low glycemic approach to diet in conjunction with an intermittent fasting protocol in which I consolidated my consumption of food more or less in an 8-hour window, and a cold water therapy stack, or therapy protocol, those actually stacked together in a very specific way had massive impact on me. And I'll just describe how. So I would wake up in the morning, and because I wouldn't have eaten for, let's say, 14 hours or 15 hours, my blood sugar at that juncture would be pretty low. There would be a slight normal rise because cortisol is going to rise in the morning. You're going to get a little bit of a blood sugar spike. But, I didn't have a lot of glucose around. And before I would break fast, essentially before I put a bite of food in my mouth, I would get into my cold plunge. And what would happen? Well, my core body temperature would plummet, right? And then my body would jump into this process of thermogenesis to bring myself back into temperature homeostasis. And it would, at that juncture, look around for an energy substrate to make heat to warm me back up. But because I was fasted and because I had adopted a relatively low glycemic diet, there wasn't a tremendous amount of glucose available as an energy substrate to make that required heat. So my body had no other choice but to opt for oxidizing fat, essentially breaking down triglycerides into free fatty acids for that energy substrate to essentially upregulate my body temperature. This is how I understood it. And the results for me were quite astonishing. I mean, I lost 60 pounds in a very, very short period of time. So that little stack was very, very powerful. And then I subsequently started to layer on a resistance training regimen. And that's when I kind of really saw the complete regulation of blood sugar levels. As I began to develop more skeletal muscle, that skeletal muscle basically just served as a vacuum for glucose. And it was that little Rubik's Cube for me that made a huge difference in my life. And like you say, it didn't require hours upon hours upon hours. It required a relatively dedicated morning practice that could be done in a relatively short period of time. And then, 3 or 4 significant resistance training sessions per week.
You talk about also eating stressed plants in your book.
Yeah.
Define what that is for us, and what does the science say about that?
Yeah, so I think Jeffrey Bland was the first person to introduce me to this concept of xenohormetins or stress plants. A lot of people may be familiar with Resveratrol.
I was like, maybe the French were the first to introduce us to
that's
this.
true. Yeah. Well, you say that because Resveratrol is found in the skins of grapes. And really, it was a defense mechanism that this fruit built in relation to insult, hostile, in their case, fungi, right? So this was an antifungal, a natural occurring antifungal that exists in the skins of grapes. And, vintners or winemakers tend to purposefully stress their grapes, not for the polyphenol content necessarily.
That's the byproduct, the bonus.
But for the taste.
Yeah.
And parenthetically, the most stressed grape I learned was the Pinot Noir varietal. And so there was, Resveratrol, which was then famously kind of studied by this Australian biologist named David Sinclair, where he was, I think, started with yeast and then moved on to mice studies, and he was giving them resveratrol, and he was seeing a great extension of lifespan. Now, I think that I'm not actually very confident that resveratrol actually applies to humans in the expansion of human lifespan, because There's sirtuins, which is like the pathway that it addresses. It hasn't really been shown in humans to actually, that resveratrol actually has that same impact. But the basic concept is that plants, they don't really have immune systems like humans, but they build defense mechanisms in relation to their environment. And there are certain compounds and molecules in those plants that when we eat them, the benefits then are conferred to humans. So we talked about resveratrol, and by the way, you can't just get resveratrol from wine.
Yeah.
I think you have to drink like 1,000 glasses per day to get the dosage or something.
Yeah, all of our winemakers, they had really good studies coming out in their favor. Turns out wasn't so helpful.
Yeah, not so helpful. But we've heard of other compounds like quercetin or luteolin or curcumin, or ECGC, which is found in green tea. These xenohormetins, or we know them in many cases as polyphenols, seem to confer a health benefit. So the plants do the stressing for us, and then we get some of that benefit. And, Jeffrey Bland introduced me to putatively the most stressed plant in the world, which he deems as Himalayan tartary buckwheat, which is this buckwheat that evolved in the Himalayas. So if you think about what it would be like to be growing in Himalayan soil, it would probably be very stressful, right?
Yeah.
There'd be a lot of adversity, a lot of fluctuation in temperature, rocky soil, wind shearing, et cetera. And quite, miraculously over the course of evolution, this particular plant, developed, I think it's actually a berry, developed, a tremendous amount of compounds that seem to confer benefits to humans. So this is the concept. I think there's a lot of data still to be amassed here, to be totally candid. But I think, more and more it's showing that like our gut microbiome really profit from polyphenols. And, as a product of a polyphenol-rich diet, our bacteria, our good gut bugs, will produce these metabolites, kind of these postbiotics. Sometimes the most famous one is butyrate, but there's like acetate and propionate, I think, are the other ones. That's sort of like the three kings of postbiotics. And it's amazing how much we've outsourced to our bacteria in terms of human function. So butyrate is just this unbelievable short-chain fatty acid that helps kind of maintain the integrity of the gut lining. It upregulates insulin sensitivity, et cetera. And there's all these other benefits that butyrate plays. So I would say that, find your stressed plants. They generally can be found in fruits that have rich, deep coloration. And, in the book, I have like a huge list of all of the different plants and all of the different compounds and their purported benefits. So,
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing up butyrate because I have a large audience who has ADHD or their children have ADHD, and there's been recent research coming out showing butyrate can actually help with executive function. So what does that come back to? The health of our gut. It's also why I say, like, eat ghee, like Ayurveda had it right, like it's a great source of butyrate. But to look at how leveraging these stress plants, yes, it helps in the world of longevity. Yes, it helps in cardiometabolic health. It can help with hormones, but to even see the benefits of cognitive function. And it's something that I often say to people, like, if research is saying it helps with the most dysregulated nervous systems, which are those who are neurodivergent, like, what is it going to do for you? It can have such positive impacts and benefits.
Yeah.
You have 10 protocols in the book. My audience, we've got a lot of chronically stressed people, a lot of people facing burnout. How does someone start to navigate this experimentation of N of 1 to understand, like, what is the stack that's going to work for me? Do I have to do all 10 protocols? What is the starting place, and how do I start to figure out, is it working? Is this true for me?
Yeah. Well, first, I think you need to take a really honest inventory of your own life. I mean, part of my thesis is that chronic disease, or the majority of chronic disease, is the result of chronic ease. Essentially, we've engineered our lives at every turn for comfort and convenience. And that comfort and convenience really like hijacks our biology in many cases, right? You know, we have this surfeit of endless calories available to us at all times. You know, Bryce, by the end of this podcast, could order up any kind of food, and it would be waiting for us at the front gate, right?
And that's,
like,
I'm going to just say, that's the thing about being in LA is like Uber Eats, you can get very many plants on there. But I was just thinking that today as we, it's our last day here. So people don't know, we've been living together for a few days. Thank you for having us.
The rumors will
in our
fly.
house. Well, and let me just also say that you walk the talk, because I saw you out there doing the sauna, doing the cold plunge, doing all the things. Like, you're not one of those people that's like, I wrote this book, or maybe you didn't even write your book, because some people don't do that. You actually wrote your book because you actually do these things and you continue to do them. But I digress. My point is that LA is so amazing in terms of like the variety of food that you can get. But what Uber Eats always shows me first is like, hey, why don't you just order like the hash browns and the muffin and like all, and I'm like, wow. Even that convenience like factor, you have to wade through that as well. Like all of the sponsored ones are like, here is the absolute metabolic obscenity to start your day with.
Right.
And this morning we did omelets and vegetables, but it's that convenience factor. The convenience isn't always bad, but sometimes you're faced with like, this. Sometimes I think having so many choices leads to this decision fatigue and also makes it difficult, which is why my point was like 10 protocols, that's going to create decision fatigue in some people. Where do you start? So taking the inventory.
So as you're taking the inventory, where have you essentially leaned into too much convenience in your life, Because we know that even just cooking your own meals is almost always going to be healthier than DoorDash. Almost always. And so actually taking a really honest inventory about like areas in which you need to improve. Like, let's just look at exercise for a moment, because there's just endless data around exercise, right? And its benefits. So, one of the things that I really try to recommend is people like really reformat their relationship with exercise. So ask yourself this question, like, how did I evolve, right? Well, we evolved walking a tremendous amount, right? We walked maybe 7 to 10 miles a day. That equates to about 14,000 or 20,000 steps, depending on how far you're moving with each step. But we also lifted heavy things. We built structures. We gathered firewood, et cetera. And then every once in a while, we were forced to probably sprint against our will, being chased by like an ungulate or something. So there's your protocols right there for your movement protocols. It's like walk a lot, lift heavy things from time to time, and get your heart rate up a couple times a week. That's pretty simple. But then beyond that, what we did for hundreds of thousands of years is we just moved as an integrated part of our life. We didn't have Google Cal with a little fluorescent box at the bottom of the day that said 5:30 to 6:15 equinox, chronic cardio on the elliptical or something. We just moved. And so this is a place where I think, people can really do a really easy inventory. It's like, am I sitting all day? Am I leading that sedentary life that leads to cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, sarcopenia, et cetera?
Yeah.
Or can I begin to essentially reformat my relationship with movement and just integrate it into the course of my day? Instead of booking like a 50-minute Zoom or an hour-long Zoom call, book a 50-minute Zoom call and use those 10 minutes to take a walk or do some air squats or do some push-ups. I mean, I always do that even between podcasts and stuff like that.
You were doing push-ups.
Yeah.
I hope somebody caught behind the scenes. You did push-ups before you sat down.
Yeah, just finding those areas. Now we have like an acronym for that. I think it's called NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. You don't need an acronym. You just need to essentially start to integrate moving your body, like do the dishes in an animated way. Like in my household here, I have pull-up bars in a number of my doorways. So when I'm walking by, I can just like, okay, I'm a big pull-ups guy. I'll just knock out like 10 or 12 pull-ups like really quickly. To constantly have that my body in a form within movement. I mean, since the early 70s, this is a crazy statistic, Jolene. Like we built 45,000 gyms in the United States, 45,000 places to grunt and sweat, yet obesity rates have tripled, almost quadrupled in that same time period. So something's not working there.
We're on the track of WALL-E.
Yeah, that's
right?
totally, yeah.
Like to be in the chairs and just laying there, like, yeah.
It'll take us a long time evolutionarily to adapt to Twinkies. Evolution's very, very, very slow. Yeah. Culture is very, very, very fast. And so it creates all these evolutionary mismatches, right? Where it's like that surfeit of endless calories, temperature neutrality. Most of us spend most of our lives in these temperature-regulated environments with a little digital box on the wall. Well, guess what? We have an internal thermostat. It's like right back there.
Zoom in.
Yeah, zoom in around our hypothalamus that, has built-in mechanisms to deal with stress. We get very, very hot. What do? We perspire. We get very, very cold. What do? We shiver, right? But now we're also discovering that there's more to actually getting very, very deliberately hot and very, very deliberately cold. Like getting deliberately hot also has cardiovascular benefits. There's tons of data. Rhonda Patrick has done a really amazing job like rounding up these meta-analyses from clinical studies from Finland, right, around sauna. So the cardiovascular benefits are pretty much undeniable right now around sauna. And anyone that's ever been in a deliberately hot environment kind of knows that, your heart rate starts to go up. It's sort of a zone, it sort of mimics exercise on a zone 2 basis. But then we're learning about all these other things, like you get hot and your brain or your body starts to activate the production of all of these proteins, like heat shock proteins, right? That these proteins that maintain the three-dimensional functionality of other proteins, et cetera, three-dimensional shape. Or BDNF, this is a molecule that's kind of in the zeitgeist these days, right? Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. When you get hot, you essentially create this molecule that essentially helps to maintain neural function, and even some people say activates neurobiogenesis, like the creation of new neurons in your brain, even later into life, right? So there seems to be all of these other benefits to aligning the way we live with how we evolved. Because when we lived on the Serengeti, we had to deal with massive fluctuations in temperature. We had to deal with being really hot, deal with being really cold. I mean, and there's so many areas to probe at. I mean, our relationship with light, right? We used to wake up more or less with the sun, and set our circadian rhythm with getting the right amount of that band of the electromagnetic wave spectrum known as blue light in the inferior part of our retina for 20 minutes, which would essentially, through a whole variety of mechanisms, signal the pineal gland to produce melatonin at the right time of day and about 14 hours later. But now, of course, we love Larry David so much that we want to binge Curb Your Enthusiasm, into the night. But what does that do? That hijacks our own engineering, because that blue light is essentially an endocrine disruptor. It's disrupting the normal balance of the secretion of hormones at the right time of day. So this is like where I think, people can just do a pretty honest inventory of how they're truly living, and is it in alignment with how they evolved.
Yeah, and I think recognizing as well, just because it's been normalized in our society doesn't mean it's actually a normal thing for the human body. As you talk about light disruption, it was interesting because as the street lamps started to go into cities, very important, cut down crime, makes it safer, we love that. But there was a study done that showed that it started to have an impact on women's menstrual cycles and shifting ovulation. And very quickly, because I feel like the masculine energy that tries to dominate women's health of women themselves to try to be like, we're not that different from men and we can do anything they do. They refute these things very quickly to be like, no, we're not so weak that it impacts us. And it's like, whoa. What's really interesting, so you and I are both like rare book fans. And so I've spent a lot of time, I love going through like old medical textbooks, and you see these texts written by midwives talking about, they weren't even called midwives then, they were just the birth workers, talking about women being in sync with the moon, which makes sense to be ovulating with the moon, because what would we do evolutionarily speaking when the bright light is disrupting our melatonin and waking us up, yet predators are outside? Stay inside and have sex. Like, wow, biology is really smart. So we see this pattern of women ovulating with the full moon cycle, getting their period with the new moon cycle. It doesn't mean like, and I actually wrote about this in Beyond the Pill, like if you're flipped and just these ideas that are considered like archaic and fringe, and yet we see that light pollution even today can disrupt our cycles. And I think you calling it basically this endocrine disruptor is absolutely on point. I know people are going to argue against it and say like, oh no, it's not a plastic or things like that. But all of these inputs, our body is super sensitive to the environment. Going through this to ask the question, number one, how do I survive? Because that's goal number one. And number two is, how do I reproduce? And for women, we have to be more sensitive to the environment, because that second question can be life-threatening. So we have to know, is this environment safe for that now? And that is some of the earliest changes we see. Maybe it's not loss of ovulation, not loss of hormones, but the dysregulation of the hormones, the hormone shifting, that we've got too many negative stressors going on. Yeah. Now, my final question to you is about how you're doing this all as a CEO, as a father, right? You run commune, you have so many hats you wear, but there was something you said to me early on that I found really interesting. You talked about the space in between and how you've kind of more arrived to embracing that. If people don't know, you ran Wanderlust, which was like the great yoga festivals of our time. I was a yoga instructor. We always talked about like the real practice is in the space between the movements, in the silence, in the stillness. However, despite having all of this time in the health and wellness space, it seems like there was this evolution of arriving to really embodying this awareness. And why I want to highlight this, and I think it's important, is because often, especially as women, we feel like, too late, I'm 40. Too late, I'm 50. Too late, I'm 60. Too late, why didn't I learn this sooner? I'm too late to all of this and life is too busy. What do you say to that?
Yeah, this is great. Thank you for asking that question. For 5 decades, I really inhabited a story about myself that I told myself, which is that Jeff is just the chubby kid that will never be liked. He'll do anything to please people in order to be liked. His self-worth is really based through the eyes of others, and that's never going to change. My fate is written in the stars of my genetics. And then I had to have an awakening. And the awakening was both mystical and medical, candidly. I started to really study Eastern religions. And one of the tenets of Buddhism, for example, is impermanence. Like the Buddha had this revelation, this awakening under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago, without the luxury of an electron microscope or germ theory or anything like that, that essentially everything in the universe was impermanent. It's subject to decay, constructing, deconstructing. So clinging to anything or craving anything was futile because it will only create suffering. I really resonated with that spiritual message. But then as I started to study human physiology, I also found that when you open the hood on my organism, what you also find is impermanence. And this really violated my sense of self, because Jeff wakes up in the morning and goes in front of the mirror and like does a little flex. And I'm like, Jeff more or less is the same guy as he was yesterday, because my sense of self is underwritten by this physical continuity. But when you really, really look at what's happening in here, all there is change. I am, you are, Bryce is 7 octillion atoms experiencing 37 billion chemical reactions per second. If I were to extend this monologue over a minute, I will have lost 40,000 skin cells during that time period, right? We're about 70 trillion cells in our organism. 39 trillion, last I counted, more or less, is bacterial, right? Coming and going every 4 minutes to 24 hours. Essentially, change is not only possible, it's all that's on offer. And this is what I really want people to take away. Like, I changed my life when I was 50. I had a complete and utter transformation. Like, I'm a million miles away from my best self still. It is a process. It is not a product. There's no terminus. You're never there. Right? But that is my message, is that change is available to you at any juncture in your life. Because when you understand your human organism as process and product, then you can take a degree of agency to shape your behaviors and shape your environment such that you actually change the trajectory of your health journey on this spectrum towards wholeness. That is the process of healing. Or towards disease and disconnection. That's the process of ailing. And what I want people to feel is a sense of empowerment over the trajectory of that journey. And that is the key that I learned, that like I can tell myself a new story about myself because change is so available to us.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing your time. We will link to your book and make sure that it's available to everyone, because I'm sure they're going to want to see these protocols and hear more about this beautiful transformation that you went through.
Thanks so much, Jolene. I so appreciate being with you and just the opportunity to connect with really just the incredible community that you've built. I'm a community guy.
Hence commune.
Hence commune, wanderlust. And I deeply appreciate how you've cultivated and fostered a really beautiful, healthy community that doesn't always need to agree on everything, but actually agrees on one thing, which is that we all share a deep common humanity. So thanks you for doing what you do.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If this is the kind of content you're into, then I highly recommend checking out this.